talk to you now about well-being data. Yay! Okay, so I'm going to rapidly work through a few things here, most of which is covered in the introductory training modules on well-being data as well. So I'm just going to give you kind of a broad overview about what child well-being data is, why we're collecting it, and how you might use it in your strategy development process. I'm not going to spend much time at all talking about the methods, about how they're going about collecting this data. Michael always gives me a hard time for talking too much about methods, so I'm going to do virtually nothing on that, but I can answer any questions you've got afterwards. Okay, so what I'm going to cover, what is child well-being? I'm going to talk about key developmental outcomes, risk and protection. I'm going to talk about what we refer to as area wellbeing profiles. This is what we're going to be providing each of your sites with. And I'm going to talk about, broadly speaking, how you can use these area wellbeing profiles to help inform the development of your emerging strategies. So, what do we mean by child wellbeing? Now, if I had some more time, we'd do an exercise. We kind of call it the My Child test. And I'd ask each of you, what do you want for your own children? If you have children, what do you want for your own children? In terms of their health and development. And you would give me a whole list of outcomes along these lines. You want to be safe, you want to be happy, you want to be confident, you want to do well at school, you want to engage. There'd be a whole range of outcomes that you would talk about that you want for your children, your own children. And then similarly, if I asked you, what do you want when you're talking about developing services and strategies for children across your areas, you kind of reflect upon that, and there'd be a lot of commonality, I think, between what you want for your own children and what you want for all children, but there'd be probably some differences. And I think what you would think is important would probably depend on which agencies you work in. So if you're working in child social work, you're going to be really interested in good relationships and safety. If you're working in CAMS and physical health, you're obviously going to care a lot about mental health and physical health. If you're working in schools, you're going to care a lot more about engagement, academic performance and so on. So the point I'm trying to make here is that not all outcomes are equal, and that leads to a lot of kind of variation in what people mean when they're talking about child well-being and what they want to improve. So, what do we mean by child well-being? Within Better Evidence for a Better Start, we have a methodology and we have a conceptual and empirical framework, and we use good science to determine what is really critical for children's health and development. Like I said, not all outcomes are equal. Some are more predictive for children's subsequent health and development than others. This is a picture of my child actually. I have a 6-week-old baby. So when I'm thinking, when I'm going to kind of, in a minute I'm going to walk through what I think that the outcomes that we're measuring, why they're so important. I think they're really important for my child, Rose. And I think also they're going to be similarly important for all the children that you're working with in your local areas. And these aren't kind of value-laden judgments that I hold, or that others in a social work or education or a health system hold. These are outcomes that really good, robust science tell us are critical for children's health and development. This is what we're measuring right now, and this is what's going to contribute to the area wellbeing profiles that each of you are going to be provided with. So, what is a key developmental outcome? In the area wellbeing profiles, we're going to provide you with data on these critical outcomes. They are developmentally specific outcomes that are predictive of children's subsequent health and development. And if children are not meeting these developmental milestones, these developmental outcomes, there's increased likelihood that their subsequent development will be knocked off course. As Michael said earlier, that's not necessarily to say that it's going to completely derail them, but it will increase the likelihood that they'll have problems later on down the line. We know which outcomes are most predictive because both in this country, in the UK and across the world, there's a whole range of longitudinal studies that have followed children from birth, measured a whole range of outcomes, and have followed those children over decades, well into adulthood in many cases, and to see what the outcome, what the impact is of those outcomes, how predictive they are further down the line. And it's drawing upon these studies and the science from these studies that we've used to determine what are those most critical outcomes for children's subsequent health and development. So the key developmental outcomes that we measure, these area wellbeing profiles, are predictive, and we know they're predictive because we've drawn upon good, robust science. The key developmental outcomes are also malleable. They're things that you can change. There's all sorts of outcomes that you could measure, but you have very little chance of actually shifting or making a big impact on. All of the key developmental outcomes that we're measuring here are things that it's in your power to do something about with this investment. You can invest in services, strategies, processes to help improve these outcomes, and therefore improve the life chances of children as they grow up. And finally, these outcomes are naturally measurable. You know, we need to be able to measure them reliably, we need to be able to measure them efficiently, so that we can create these area wellbeing profiles for you, and any time, so that you can also track changes in these outcomes at the population level over time to see if what you're doing is having an impact. So that's the concept of a key developmental outcome. And I'm just going to kind of run you through what are the kind of these key outcomes that we're measuring right now that are going to contribute to the area wellbeing profiles. The first is naturally healthy gestation and birth. Here talking about prematurity, birth weight. Obviously you need to go after a really kind of good start, and this starts at kind of -9 months. Really. The second is strong communication and language development. If children aren't developing those critical language skills and communication skills at an early age, that's going to have a real kind of knock-on effect, both for their kind of their social development and their subsequent academic and school forms of engagement. Third, social and emotional development. So this is the ability for children to interact with other children, with adults, and form good, strong relationships. It's also the ability to, let's see if this one, school readiness is another critical outcome that we measure within these area wellbeing profiles. This is kind of a broad composite measure that kind of includes some of this language development and social development. It also includes aspects of behaviour development, but it's really about are children prepared and ready when they go to school to engage in learning and interact with others. We'll also be measuring some early years foundation stage performance there. I'll come to that in just a sec. Emotional and behavioural regulation. So again, this is tied in some ways to school readiness, but this is the ability for children to be able to regulate their own emotions and their own behaviours, to kind of stop and think before they act. We know that this is critical for children's subsequent health and development. It's important for, again, relationships, school, and stopping and thinking really before engaging in risky behaviours. Another one here is the absence of early onset behavioural problems. So we know again from these robust longitudinal studies that in teenage years kids act out, they engage in poor behaviour, and that's fairly typical. Most kids, most teenagers act out. But we know that if children in the early years, around 4 to 8 years, really start acting out and engaging in really kind of poor behaviour that's consistent, that's what scientists refer to as early onset, lifelong persistent antisocial behaviour. And when behavioural problems develop and take root really strongly at this particular kind of developmental stage, has a really strong predictive influence on later development. We're talking, it's predictive in terms of adult engagement in the criminal justice system. So it's a real kind of critical indicator here. And finally, we're interested in some kind of chronic health indicators across the board too. So these are persistent health impairments, and obesity being one of those. So this is a list of the key developmental outcomes that are being measured in the surveys that are taking place in the areas now, and that will be providing you with these area wellbeing profiles. In addition to key developmental outcomes, we also measure a whole range of what we call risk and protective factors. And these are things that will influence the likelihood that children meet or have problems in these key outcome areas. So a risk factor is something that increases the likelihood that kids will have problems in these areas. A protective factor is, broadly speaking, something that will buffer the effects of those risks. And we measure a whole range of risk and protective factors within the surveys, and we'll be providing you those data in the area wellbeing profiles too. I'm not going to go through all of them because there's a lot that we measure, but broadly speaking, they're categorised under prenatal and infancy, and here we're looking at things like mother's substance use during pregnancy, teen motherhood, nutrition, breastfeeding is a real critical influence here in those infancy years. We measure a range of, kind of within-child risk and protective factors, including things like physical activity, exercise, hyperactivity, how pro-social children are to one another, for example. Family functioning is critical here. There's a whole range of risk factors and protective factors that we measure within the area wellbeing surveys. These include things like parent-child warmth, family conflict within the home. A really strong one, which is up here, is the establishment of kind of clear and consistent rules and routines within a family. So we measure that. And obviously, parents' own experiences and behaviours themselves, irrespective of family functioning, is a critical driver of children's health and development. So parent stress, parent mental health, we know is a critical driver of whether or not children do well in these outcome areas. Whether parents have good social support networks to draw upon if they need it. Finally, we measure some kind of community and economic influences on children's health and development. We know that poverty naturally is a strong pervasive influence, but there's some more kind of fine-grained social drivers of children's outcomes as well. Community cohesion, what we refer to as collective efficacy, the degree to which communities, people within those communities look out for one another. Those are strong influences on children's health and development. So this is just kind of a brief overview of the types of things that we measure within these surveys that are taking place, and that will be the data we'll be providing you with. The thing I want to emphasise is that the outcomes are developmentally specific. These are all focused here on the early years. We're focusing broadly from 0 to 8 years. I know the better evidence spread starts focused primarily on 0 to 3 years. We go wider than that because we know that some of these outcomes that take place a little bit kind of further on development are directly kind of follow on, so these are related. You don't just want to be too narrow. So the developmentally specific. You'll also notice that, and those kind of data-orientated people in the room will be thinking, well, we have some of this data already. Why do we need a survey for this? And it's true, there are some very good existing data that are available. We have good data on early years foundation stage. There's good data on obesity, for example, at 5 years, as long as variation there, so we look at it at 11 years. There's good data on poverty and so on. But the vast majority of those things there does not exist good, reliable data at the local level on these things. There's good national data from good existing studies, but these type of data do not exist at a local level. So what these area wellbeing profiles will provide you with is some really state-of-the-art data on a whole range of critical aspects of children's health and development that you won't currently have really robust, reliable data on. And this is what the area wellbeing profiles will provide you with. This isn't necessarily what the data is going to... Sorry, a quick, I'll take the majority of the questions at the end. If there's any clarifying questions, I'll take them now.
Will it link the two together? So will it sort of look at those people who aren't necessarily meeting certain outcomes and what some of the risk factors in those homes are? Or because, you might have good early foundation stage information locally, but we don't necessarily know the sort of forensic background or I suppose the warmth in the family home or, some of those protection risk factors.
Sure. Well, there's limits what we can... There's limits to the analysis that we can do within the time that's available. What we'll do is we'll provide you with the linkages that we know that exist between these risk factors, protective factors, and outcomes, so that you can draw some good inferences there. We will make the data available to the raw data available to you afterwards, and that will allow you to undertake further analysis. But I think for the production of the area wellbeing profiles, we're not going to go kind of crazy with analysis, but we will draw those linkages that are available. Other quick clarifying question?
Given that we've only got 1 year of the earliest knowledge stage profile data, which recently changed,
Yeah.
and there is a consultation out at the moment to actually remove it altogether, where does that leave that data?
Well, this is something, this kind of ties in nicely here. So that, like I said, the vast majority of the data that we are collecting through the surveys in the area wellbeing profiles don't currently exist. There's a few items that we think are robust, solid indicators. Childhood obesity at 11 is one. Really good data from health on health, gestation and birth, for example. So we're pulling in those data where they exist into the area wellbeing profiles. The earliest foundation stage is one that we're kind of tentatively including in there, although there are limits to how kind of robust it's going to be. So we will include it, and you have that data to hand already, so you can use it or not use it. What we will have is really robust data that you won't have on school readiness, for example, children's social, emotional development, and you can use that perhaps more confidently than you can administrative data. Okay, so broadly what this will look like here, these are the key developmental outcomes. We're going to read this across the bottom, and what we'll do is we'll show you broadly, in broad terms, the prevalence of children who are struggling or not meeting these key developmental outcomes. This is a hypothetical example of what this will look like. And what it will allow you to do is to see in which areas, in which key developmental outcomes are children in your area doing relatively well or relatively poorly. Now, of course, that data on its own doesn't tell you very much, so what we'll be doing is adding some points of comparison to that. That point of comparison is going to be the average across the 15 sites, so you'll be able to compare yourselves to the average across the sites, broadly speaking. And again, it's not going to, it doesn't tell you a huge amount, but it'll give you a broad indication about whether children in your area are doing relatively well or relatively poorly on each of those outcomes. And that will help you better understand where you might start thinking about prioritising areas for investment in your strategy development. Yeah.
Can I just ask, you said across the 15 sites, do you mean at borough level or at...
Yeah, good question. What we're going to do in the area wellbeing profiles, you're going to get a local authority-wide picture. So we're doing these surveys at the local authority level, and then the target wards that you've identified, oversampling in those areas, and you're also going to get that same picture within those target wards as well. So what you'll get is two bars, one for the local authority level and one for the target ward areas, and that that will help kind of inform some of your investments. What we typically find, and when we do this work in other areas, is that the patterns are broadly consistent, but you'll see some local variations, some specific pockets of these different areas.
Can I just check whether it's the wards areas in total or individual within our target?
So within the...
Broken down
No, you're going to get, we're limited by the kind of numbers here. What you'll get is a local authority representative picture, and you'll also get a representative picture of target wards combined. So if you only have one ward identified as your target ward, so you get that picture, that'll be representative of that ward, and it'll be oversampled as such. If you have 4 or 5 target wards identified within your ward or local area, the data will be combined for those target wards, and you'll get that overall picture. We would love to give you ward-by-ward data, but it gets incredibly expensive and time-consuming to do that. We don't have the resources to be able to do that.
So can I confirm your sampling will be equal across them? So you won't take, for that ward area, your sampling and your survey calls from a particular area, you'll make sure that it's evenly distributed?
Yes. What we're doing, I won't go into all the sampling here, but we're doing a particular kind of sampling approach will ensure that the data is proportionally represented within your area. So you get representative data at the local authority and representative data oversampled at the ward level. So you have greater numbers to give you more precision with the data in your target wards, but it will be representative of those target wards. Okay.
Just one cheeky question, do we get the ward data or not?
Yep. I mean, this is your data. I mean, we're collecting it on your behalf, and will be providing you with this data. What we won't be able to do within the kind of time available is there's a lot of analysis, a lot of cleaning, a lot of work that needs to go into this. We'll be producing these area wellbeing profiles for you, and we'll make those profiles available to you. And then at the end of the strategy development process, we'll then hand over the data to you with some guidance on how to use it. So you can use that data. What we're not able to do is to do a whole bunch of extra analysis for you on that. But yes, we'll be making the raw data available to you, clean, ready to go, with good instructions on how to use it, essentially. Okay.
Just a quick one. How long does the survey take, and how easily would it be able to sort of replicate a local level if we wanted to in the future? Is that something we could do? Could we get that?
Yep, absolutely. I mean, the survey takes, in terms of how long it takes for individual respondents to take it, takes between half an hour and 45 minutes for parents to complete. It's quite a kind of complex survey with lots of routing, and depending on how old the kid is, and all sorts of aspects to it. And we can make available the survey tools and the instrumentation, and there's no reason why it can't be used further down the line. And I'll talk about the potential to use this to monitor trends over time shortly. And in terms of how long it's taking us to produce these area wellbeing profiles, survey work started mid-August. It's finishing up mid-October, and we'll be getting the area wellbeing profiles finished and ready during kind of early to middle of November, early November. It's taking us about 3 months to do this work across 15 sites. Broadly speaking, it's about 600 interviews per area. What that means is we're across the 15 sites, some are kind of larger than others, we're doing over 11,000 interviews, surveys. What that means is we're knocking on about 70,000 doors to do that survey, so we appreciate that we're doing an awful lot of work in a very, very short space of time. But there's no reason why you can't take this and do it in your own local areas going forward in the future. And we can talk to you about how that will work to ensure it from us. So this is the overview of the key outcomes. We'll also present similar kind of data on these risk and protective factors. So again, we get very fine-grained kind of detail on what profiles of risk and protection look like within each of your areas. Again, with points of comparison to it. Another thing that you'll get from the data is the indication of what the level of need is in your areas and the degree to which local targeted services are meeting that need. So again, this is a hypothetical example, but this is from, we have hard data from doing this in other areas, so this is fairly typical. What we typically find is that about 1 in 4 children will have some high level of need. They'll be struggling against some of those key developmental outcomes, will have high elevated levels of risk. So about 1 in 4 children will probably have some problems with their health and development that are not insignificant. And then when we can estimate the proportion of those children and young people that are receiving targeted services, and this is something that we assess within the survey too. So you can look at the degree to which your targeted services are meeting the needs of the population as a whole within your area. And this will lead you to thinking about, it will inform your strategy about a whole series of ways. In this example, we see that 1 in 4 children are red block there have high levels of need. And in this hypothetical example, about 8% of children are touched by some targeted service, and you can overlay the children that receive that targeted service with those that have high levels of need. And in this hypothetical example, you'll see that there appears to be a mismatch between need and targeted services. So these type of data, you can see how they might get you thinking for your structural development purposes. You might think about shrinking the size of that red circle. You might think about moving that black circle, targeted services, more try and get that more overlaid with those that have high levels of need. So it's these type of data that you'll get with your area wellbeing profiles as well. So, finishing up, how can we use these data to inform your strategy development? The first thing is you can use this to prioritise key developmental outcomes for intervention or investment. We measure about 10 or so key developmental outcomes. You have limited resources to do this. Whether you get the money from big or not, you have limited resources, and you want to invest it wisely where need is greatest. So these data will point you to where that need appears to be greatest and where there might be a good logical point for intervention. You can use the data to understand the size and characteristics of potential target group populations. You can estimate the demographics of those target groups. So say, for example, say school readiness and emotional regulation are two outcomes that are a particular cause for concern in your local area. You can use the data to estimate what the size of the target population is that has problems in those areas, and what do they look like, and what's the demographics of that population. And again, that will help inform strategy development and service design efforts. You can use the data on risk and protection to give you greater specificity when you're thinking about what specific types of interventions or services you may be looking to put in place to improve outcomes in those areas. So, early onset behaviour, for example, there's a variety of interventions, evidence-based interventions that are available to, that are proven to improve behaviour in the early years. Some of them are really good at tackling poor family management, whereas others are great, that's the route in which they get to improving children's behaviour. Other interventions work on improving social cohesion and children's engagement with school, for example. Having the data on risk and protection will allow you to get more fine-grained to tailor specific services to outcomes that are relevant based on your local profiles of need, risk and protection. And that data, so that will point you towards existing evidence-based services, whereas Michael said earlier, there's a limited pool of that available, particularly in the early years. These data will also help guide you when thinking about the development of new innovative services, the local shops rather than the Tesco's, as it were. Data can, like I said, help inform development of new services. It can give you some realistic estimations about the scope of population-wide level change. So if the data hypothetically tells you that prevalence of likely conduct disorder is running at twice at what you'd expect, you're not going to get that back to the national averages overnight. But what the data will do in conjunction with the what works evidence is it can give you an estimation about to what degree might you be able to improve behaviour, how many children and young people may benefit based on the evidence of what works. So you can make some realistic projections using this data on what change you may have, broadly speaking, over which period of time. And finally, related to that, is you can use these data as a baseline for monitoring change over time. And this isn't a robust evaluation tool in itself. This will give you a broad snapshot picture of need at this point in time. You can potentially use this survey again, perhaps you might administrate every 2 years, every 3 years, every 5 years, for example, and you could use that to see whether the strategies and services that you're putting in place appear to be having an influence on population level change. It's not going to tell you whether or not what you're doing is responsible necessarily for those changes, but it will give you an indication of whether population level change is happening over time. Michael said, broadly speaking, over what period of time might you expect to see change? And the best evidence that we have on this is if you were to take services to scale to reach every eligible child or family in an area, and that's an important point, and I think there's the potential to do that in these target areas. But if you were taking evidence-based services to scale in these areas, you'd expect to see changes in those risk and protective factors, broadly speaking, over a 2 to 3 year period, and you'd start seeing changes in those key local outcomes over a 4 to 5 year period. Now, these changes aren't going to happen overnight when you take these interventions to scale, but these data can be used as a baseline to monitor that over time. So, that is really an overview of the wellbeing data. If you want to find out more information, I'll take questions in just a sec. The Dartington BEBS website has some good information on the wellbeing survey. There's the web address there. There's more information about the methodology. There's a fairly detailed FAQ on that that gives more detail around various aspects of the methodology. There's information about the ethics process of review and the documentation that sits alongside that. So that's kind of our first stop with questions.